Thanks very much. Thanks, Paul, for your talk. It's great to be here. I'm going to ask you a few questions, and I'm going to ask you guys to tell me what I'm talking about, okay? You ready? Ready?
Yes.
Okay, cool. All right. This is something that's spread easily from person to person. It's something that anyone can transmit from themselves to another. You don't always know when you're transmitting it. Pardon me? Is that an answer? I can't hear you.
Oh, we're supposed to guess?
Yeah. Were you guessing?
Germs.
Germs, yeah. No, I'm not talking about germs. It can cause a lot of fear. A virus? Pardon me? Ideas. Or, let me finish my questions off. That is the right answer. My other ones were, it's something that can spread rapidly. It's difficult for the government to control. After spreading rapidly, some people can become immune to them, and then their effect dissipates. So whether it's ideas, news, information, rumor, gossip, or these are all forms of communication, you can see there are some perhaps parallels and analogies and similarities between what we do as humans when we communicate and the viruses that Paul just talked about. And that's what I want to talk about. So the title of my talk is News Contagious? And we're going to talk about that for the next 12.5 minutes. I don't know if any of you recently heard about a study that was conducted with Facebook, actually by Facebook, in which Facebook altered the news feeds of certain individuals to see if those news feeds would change essentially their mood. Anyone hear about that study? Probably you all contributed data to this study unknowingly. And that was actually very controversial that they did that from an ethical standpoint. But the conclusion of the study was that ideas, emotions, whatever it is that gets transmitted over your Facebook feed in this case, or just if you want to call it news, can have a kind of contagious effect from one to another. Even by changing the news feed of my friend, that could affect my own kind of outlook. So that's the idea of contagion physically, and it can exist socially as well. And indeed, there's a fair amount of study of this idea of social contagion. Now, I don't want to overdo the analogies between virus, which is kind of a physical phenomenon, and the news ideas that I'm about to talk about, but there's a lot of interesting parallels, and they really get to this question of fear, really, which is what we're dealing with when we're talking about the media and the Ebola situation. As Paul, I think, very correctly recognized at the end of his talk, and the idea here would be to see, can we get to a situation in which we can communicate accurately without that fear? The Facebook study is a good example, a recent one. There's been a lot of studies like that one with all different kinds of media kind of documenting this idea of contagion to one extent or another. I want to tell you, I don't know much about pandemics or epidemics or viruses. I know more now, and I'm growing to love them as you do a little bit. It doesn't hurt to hear them described in a nice Irish brogue, and so, that's cool. But I took a look at, I think, at the WHO website to look at the stages of a pandemic, which is a big epidemic, I guess you would say, right? And the stages are described essentially as, first there's really no virus has emerged, or it's just kind of hidden away in the bats and so forth. And then it starts to, by whatever reason, transmit to a few humans. So the curve is kind of going up like this. And then you kind of get into this big upward sweep as it finds more and more human hosts. But eventually, it will peak out at some kind of, as high as it's going to get, drop off and return, hopefully, to the pre-epidemic levels. And I'm sure there's epidemics and pandemics that maybe don't match that curve exactly, but there's just this idea of a curve that kind of goes like that and then comes back down. This is actually very similar to an idea that's in the sociological literature about how we react to issues and become aware of them. It's called the issue awareness cycle. In an issue awareness cycle, we're going to have a very similar curve where we start out kind of blissfully unaware of some issue. And then for whatever reason we become aware of it. Maybe, we find Ebola has emerged in, whatever country, and maybe the news kind of overdo it and so forth. So we'll have a first awareness, and what often is then an alarmed reaction to it as society, if you will, mobilizes to figure out what we need to do to deal with this issue. So you'll see this curve of awareness of that issue go up in the same way that kind of the curve of that pandemic would go up. And this is society, and not just news, but all different aspects of society, figuring out, whoa, we've got to deal with this thing, what are we going to do? But then no issue ever just keeps going up, obviously, and usually what happens with many issues is either the public or the government or scientists or whoever are the institutions dealing with those issues realize oftentimes, number one, the cost of dealing with that issue. You know, environmental issues would be a good example of this. We can all become very panicked about something like climate change, but it can be hard to sustain concern as people realize, oh wait, there's a cost to solving those issues. And number two, we also, I think, become sort of more accustomed and used to dealing with that issue. And so the issue awareness cycle has then this same kind of fall off, as I described with the kind of stages of an epidemic. And concern or our awareness of an issue will then return to some pre-problem levels. Usually what happens is we'll be slightly more aware than we were when we started. The question is, when we've gone through that cycle, will we have reached a point where we're somewhat more informed and more ready to deal with it the next time it comes around? And Ebola is something certainly that we've been through, I think, several cycles of this since it emerged in maybe the 70s, or I think something like that, right? So that's an interesting parallel that, you know, that those cycles are present in that same way. There's some other interesting ideas from the communication literature, the psychological literature, sociology, where we see parallels between information and sort of, I guess, almost describe them as medical parallels. There's an idea, for instance, from persuasion theory, which studies how we persuade one another, called inoculation. Inoculation, of course, is a concept which says that sort of a weakened form of a virus or something like that will confer immunity. In the persuasion literature, we have a similar idea where if, for instance, I want to get you to quit smoking, I might present you with weakened counter-arguments to quitting smoking. A counter-argument to quitting smoking might be, oh, it helps me lose weight or keep weight off. If I can weaken that counter-argument in some way, shape, or form, maybe with a study says, well, actually, you know, it doesn't help do that, then, you know, this is something that might help you resist or persuasion. So the inoculation parallel, an interesting one. Another one that I think is interesting, especially in the case with Ebola, would come from the media effects literature. This is kind of my area where we really try to examine what are the impact of the mass media on our attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors in almost any aspects of society. We know from many, many years of studying media violence, a kind of perennial concern, that levels of violence that we see in the media these days are more graphic than what you would have seen when I was in college, you know, 30 years ago, or when I was a kid in the 60s. And partly we think that's because over time, both as individuals and as a society, as a culture, we are getting kind of desensitized to violence, so that it kind of takes more, if you will, to achieve some kind of effect. Perhaps in the way that, you know, it takes more alcohol to get an effect if you've been consuming certain amounts for your whole life, right? So desensitization, inoculation, these are ideas that show that there are a lot of interesting parallels between the physical world and the world of communication. And this contagion idea is a big one in our literature as well, whether you want to call it social contagion or other forms of contagion. Human means of communication, one to another, are just as much a network as physical connections that viruses can move across. So, and you know, it would only strengthen the medical analogies that I've been talking about to say that a lot of times when we talk about something that goes big on the internet, like you know, Kim Kardashian or whatever, we say what? That went viral, right? So the term viral, of course, is based on this idea that there are these willing hosts out there just ready to be infected by that idea. And of course, now in the days of the internet, we have, I think, many, many more opportunities for these kinds of contagions to fire up, propagate, run their course, and then go away. And they seem to happen now almost on a daily basis. That can be both good and bad. I think right now, my perception of it is that the contagion that was the Ebola scare has run its course. And we could spend a long time talking about why that is so. And I've kind of hinted at some of the reasons for why that fear is there. I want to make a few observations, really. Some of them are connected, some of them are disconnected, about Ebola and the media, and then see what your questions are as well. I think, first of all, some fear is good. This is really what news evolved out of, is our need to have surveillance of the environment. If there's a huge tornado bearing down on me, I want the media to have big block letters, go in your basement, and be afraid, that sort of thing. But of course, what is the right level? And I think we've seen certainly the many media outdoing themselves in a bad way in the case of Ebola. But certainly at some level, we do expect the media to alert us to things like Ebola and other potential threats. And perhaps some level of fear is fine. I think one of the problems, though, is that we're losing a little bit of our ability to readily distinguish between quality news sources and non-quality news sources. Certainly, and I'm like you, a lot of my news just comes from a Facebook feed that is fed to me, literally, in a stream. And it's not always clear what is the provenance or the source of that particular bit of information that I click on. Now, I think we all get pretty good at eventually figuring it out. But the key word there may be eventually, right? And in the time that it takes us to, quote, eventually figure it out, will we contribute to sort of, this Ebola case, I think would be a very good example where the fear very quickly ratcheted up. And there are certainly, in this case, and there are always plenty of media outlets that are willing to feed that fear for their own purposes, unfortunately so. The headline of a paper like, I think you have the New York Post there, would be a great example of that. The Post, not known as the gold standard of, quote, responsible journalism. But there are many examples of good journalism out there, and so part of our role as educators in a college of communication is to let you know where those are and to help you know where those are. I think, the legacy news sources that are still so important, be they a newspaper, television, other media, are still there available if you're getting it through your Facebook feed, as so many people do now, or through other social media feeds, Twitter. But you've got to be aware and be responsible about the news that you're consuming. Is it the New York Times or is it BuzzFeed? Is it The Economist or, I don't have another example of a sketchy source, Paper Magazine, maybe. That's one that was out there recently. I did a check on just Google Trends on the words Ebola fear, Ebola and fear. I thought, that was just my quick research for this presentation. It's trending downward on that negative side of the curve that I was talking about. I was telling one of my partners here about my own daughter who gave me a call and was worried about, could you get Ebola if you were riding on a plane back home for Christmas? And even I said, no, I don't think you're going to get it from a plane. And but it's not that she's not an intelligent person, but this was just the kinds of questions that were out there and that actually very rational people might have been concerned about. There are more examples of bad journalism and bad policy that we could talk about here. To me, it's the interconnectedness that we now have with each other has both a positive side and kind of the dark side to that. And the positive side is we can exchange information much more readily, much more easily. And that's good in many ways. It helps us make connections with people. It helps us build friendships that we couldn't have done in the past. It even allows us to be connected to issues like what's going on in West Africa in ways that we wouldn't have been able to in the past. There is definitely a greater sense of community and connectedness that can come from that. On the other hand, there is also a greater sense of rapidity that issues like that phenomena like fear can be spread with. Just to real quickly add one last point, the other media factor that I haven't mentioned at all here is the role of the entertainment media in all of this. I think you guys in your generation, which is really my daughter's generation, probably have grown up with the highest percentage of zombie movies of any generation in the history of humankind. And you know, I saw a funny thing on Facebook which said that in every zombie movie, zombie apocalypse movie, that's starting now. There's always a government guy who says, don't worry, everything's fine, you know? And then of course everything falls apart. If we made a movie about the current, quote, Ebola crisis here in the United States, it would be a very bad movie. There would be one or two people who came and you know, one died and one didn't. And then the rest of the movie would be, looks like we're all fine. Okay, end of movie, right? Not the most entertaining movie. But we do know that exposure to entertainment media matters as well. Not that it turns us into psychological zombies, if you will, but this is the information environment that we live in. I've said enough here, so maybe take a couple of questions. Yeah, over here.
So one of the questions I have is it sounds like a lot of the problem comes with like what kind of media people want to consume, and so the media is really trying to connect to that. I'm wondering how can public health practitioners who know a lot about this disease, how can they work with the media to properly communicate risk about Ebola and diseases?
I think my quick answer to that would be they could do what Paul just did, right? Follow that example. I've worked with a lot of scientists and health practitioners over my career. A great many of them are kind of concerned and scared to put themselves out there. They're not really trained for that. You know, they're trained to be in their lab and to really communicate as objectively as possible without bias and all those kinds of traits that we really want from science. So entering that sphere, that arena, actually can be fearful for many of those kinds of people. They do work with us in our college, you know, and other similar colleges around the country, to learn about principles and to look at the research and eventually to understand that there are ways to do that more successfully. But really the only and the simple answer to that is they have to be willing to play in that game, you know. And so that's a great question, though. Yes, over here.
I heard you talk a couple weeks ago about science and the media.
Yep.
And you said that on TV, there's been an upward trend in like, that scientists are portrayed more positively and like good guys instead of bad guys. So I was wondering if there's been any sort of trend in the past couple months about how scientists and Ebola have been portrayed, if it's been better or worse. Or
Well, what I was talking about in my talk then was mainly in the entertainment media. The entertainment media haven't had a chance to really respond to Ebola yet because it's a very new crisis. So maybe 6 months from now we'll see episodes of you know, NCIS or whatever that come out and deal with Ebola. It is true that there is, you know, generally speaking, scientists in the entertainment media are a very small percentage. We tend to see a lot greater percentage of people who are doctors, lawyers, crime fighters, you know, those kinds of people. So scientists are a small minority. The concern in the past was that scientists were often represented as a slightly deranged, you know, sort of mad scientist image. Sorry, Paul, but you know, that's of course the Frankenstein stereotype. That's a very old one, and that research began maybe in the 1960s and through the 70s. We've seen as the number of channels really available to us on television, which is what my data were about, there are now, I would say, a greater variety of images about scientists. A very interesting discussion there is what you think about the cast or the characters that are portrayed on The Big Bang Theory. I'll show you probably all know, many scientists I know are very upset about that show because it portrays scientists as nerdy and, you know, with all sorts of social kinds of awkwardness and so forth. And I, you know, said to many of them, but you know, it's also a very loving portrait and they're actually shown as good people and so forth. And you know, so we argue about that. And a good bit of the tick upward in the number of scientists that are represented in today's television actually comes from that show, because it's starting from a very small number. So I don't think, you know, we'd have to do a study more on news to show how scientists are portrayed with respect to Ebola. There's been some negative press from the CDC in terms of how they handled it. That's probably perceived perhaps more of as a government issue than a science issue. But I don't have a good pat answer to that question. There'll be probably some interesting studies coming out on that. Should I take the last question?
My question is about the media specifically in terms of like the media ever taking responsibility for saying, oops, you know, we probably like stirred up some fear that we shouldn't have. Is there any culpability that ever happens, or or any sort of accountability mechanism that ever is in place?
Well, in the journalistic media, of course, there is the standard accountability mechanism of the correction, which is usually buried on, page 32. So if you get accused of something awful on page 1 on day 1, and 14 days later you're found to be innocent, oftentimes that will be, buried. In terms of this larger scale accountability that you're really talking about, because here we're not just talking about correcting errors, but it's more the philosophy of the media themselves. There are so many factors at play here, and they are believed, I think, by most people to just be built into the media. When Paul, for instance, was saying that we're a very generous country and this is what America is, and I agree with everything that he said, and it makes me feel good, we've also been a country with a long history of yellow journalism and sensationalism and so forth, in a journalistic system that is driven as much by profit as by, portrayal of the truth. We're not the only country with this issue, by the way, as you all know, and I think by and large we have really one of the better systems. I think oftentimes we kind of get to the right situation. I have sort of that feeling about Ebola where, we work through this bout of fear, and I think more and more people are realizing kind of what the reality is, which is, as Paul said, the real problem is not here, and it would be very disheartening to just kind of lock off a whole other continent because of that. But do you often see the media sort of do navel gazing and say, wow, we really screwed up on that one? Yeah, there are shows where you can see the journalists kind of kick these issues around at a higher level. They're usually, at a bad time slot on Sunday morning. You probably won't see them as much as you will see those screaming headlines, New York doc has Ebola, right? So the answer is probably much less than they should do. Probably gone over here, so. Thank you, everyone.